Jason made a new friend. His name is Daniel. Daniel only has one arm. He lost it in a car accident as a child. Jason really enjoyed Daniel's company. He invited Daniel out with some other friends. Jason was sure that the other guys would like Daniel too. "Meet us at the restaurant," said Jason. Daniel walked into the restaurant. All the other guys stared at him. Daniel got very nervous. "I hope they don't make fun of my arm," he thought. He really wanted to become friends with Jason's buddies. "Wow," said one of the guys. "That's a really nice shirt." Daniel was relieved. He was invited along every week after that. Stephen loved almost everything about his grandma. There was only one thing he hated. She always knitted sweaters for him. Stephen understood that she did it to be nice. However, all the sweaters were very ugly. Stephen visited her once a week. She had a new sweater for him each time. Stephen lived in a small apartment. There was no room for him to keep all the sweaters. He had to give all of them away. Grandma will never find out, he thought. One day, Stephen's grandma visited him by surprise. She asked to see his sweaters. "Someone stole all of them," he said. "They were too nice." She made him 10 more by the next month. Dorothy had very curly hair. She hated it. "It's too big," she always complained. Dorothy wanted to be an actress. All actresses she knew had straight hair. It always looked perfect and smooth. Every morning, Dorothy was up at 5 a.m. She spent 2 hours straightening her hair. One morning, Dorothy had a big acting audition. She was running very late. There was no time to straighten her hair. "I'm never going to get the job with this hair," she thought. She was wrong. As soon as the director saw Dorothy, she was hired. "Your hair stands out so much," he said. "You must love it." "Of course I do," replied Dorothy. Lisa grew up in a huge family. She had 6 older sisters. All of them were very beautiful. This made Lisa feel very bad. She knew she looked nothing like them. Lisa had even heard people say she was the ugly sister. As teens, the girls spent every weekend out on dates. Lisa always stayed home alone. Her sisters spent their days combing their hair and putting on makeup. Lisa spent her days reading and studying. Her sisters laughed at her a lot. As adults, all her sisters got married young. They all had handsome husbands with no brains or jobs. Lisa went to college. She became a rich scientist and traveled the world. She was the one laughing now. Kevin asked Michelle on a date. He wanted to go snowboarding. "I love snowboarding," said Michelle. This was a lie. She had never been snowboarding. She wanted to impress Kevin. "That's great," said Kevin. "Then we can go to the advanced slope." Michelle was terrified. The top of the advanced slope was extremely high. It was too late to say the truth. "This can't be that hard," she thought. "I just have to keep my balance." Michelle flew off the hill. She stayed standing for less than 2 seconds. She looked like a giant snowball by the time she reached the bottom of the slope. Kevin felt bad for her. He hugged her tight to get her warm. Her plan worked out after all. John and his friends were going on a road trip. They were driving from Los Angeles to Washington. John had everything planned out. He had prepared CDs with their favorite songs. They would sing along to them the whole way. He even packed his trunk full of their favorite snacks. John picked up his friends early in the morning. He showed them a map. It was full of dots. "These are all the stops we should make," he said. John wanted to see the Golden Gate Bridge, the Grand Canyon, Old Faithful, and many other monuments. "What song should we hear first?" asked John. All his friends were already asleep. They stayed this way the whole trip. George's best friend was visiting him. Joseph lived in Arizona. George moved to Los Angeles 2 years ago. He hadn't seen Joseph since then. George wanted his friend to have fun. He wanted to convince him to move to Los Angeles with him. George had a great idea. He would take his friend to Six Flags. They didn't have big roller coasters in Arizona. George and Joseph got on a ride called Tatsu. It was huge and had more than 5 loops. Joseph screamed more than any other people. "Isn't that great?" asked George. "If you move here, we'll be coming here all the time." Joseph never returned to Los Angeles again. SeaWorld is one of the most famous parks in the world. Thousands of people visit each year. Most of them go to see the dolphins and whales perform tricks. This is something they could never see in the wild. SeaWorld has been under a lot of pressure lately. Thousands of people have been protesting the parks. These people say that dolphins and whales should not be forced to live in such small places. They should also never be forced to perform pointless tricks. Most people are starting to agree with this. SeaWorld will hopefully start listening to the protesters soon. Helen had nothing to do one Saturday night. "Let's go to a drive-in theater," said Donna. Helen had no idea what that was. Donna told her she would love it. Helen agreed to go. Drive-in theaters play movies outdoors. People park their cars in front of a giant screen. They each get a pair of speakers. Everyone watches the movie from their cars. Helen had seen many of them in old movies. "This is where people used to go on dates," she said. She had no idea they still existed. The girls watched a horror movie. It was scarier than watching it in a room with a bunch of people. "They should bring these back," said Donna. Robert's family got together every Sunday. They always had lunch together. Every week they went to the same restaurant. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet. Robert's family loved eating. This was the perfect restaurant for them. Robert's mom always ate the most. She would serve herself at least 4 plates for one meal. His dad was a picky eater. The buffet gave him plenty of options. Aunt Nelsie loved the buffet the most. She always brought a bag with her. She would make sure no one was looking at her. Then she would drop food into the bag. Her bag was 3 times bigger than before by the time she left. Andrew Williams got a new pet. It was a baby chick. His parents brought it home one day. At first, Andrew did not like the chick. He wanted a different pet. "All of my friends have dogs or cats," he complained. The chick followed Andrew everywhere. She was very cute. After 2 months, Andrew grew very close to her. He named her Rex. Andrew got home from school one day. He started looking for Rex. He couldn't find her anywhere. Rex ran away from home, said Andrew's mom. Andrew was confused. Then he looked at the oven. His mom was cooking a chicken for dinner. Andrew cried. Mr. White had a bad habit. He was a chain smoker. Mr. White knew his addiction was unhealthy. He couldn't even take walks anymore. He spent all day coughing. Mr. White spent 1 year trying to quit smoking. He would always buy a pack and promise himself it would be the last cigarette. Mr. White went to his doctor for a checkup. His doctor asked him to take an X-ray. They found a tumor on his left lung. He had cancer from all the smoking. Mr. White went home scared. He threw out his cigarettes, but he kept one. This would finally be his last cigarette. Mr. and Mrs. Smith had a fun night out. They had been dancing all night. They did not get home until 3 a.m. They found their front window broken. They ran inside. Everything was thrown on the floor. Their televisions were missing. Their laptops were gone. Even their fancy plates were taken. Mrs. Smith started crying. "We've been robbed," she screamed. The police were called in. "It will probably be impossible to find the burglars," they said. Mr. Smith started cleaning the mess. He saw something lying by the windowsill. It was a wallet. The burglar had dropped it while jumping through the window. Mr. Gonzalez was a janitor. He was unhappy with his career. He was a smart man. He knew he could do more with his life. Mr. Gonzalez wanted to go back to college. He had always dreamed of becoming a teacher. If he finished college, this could come true. Mr. Gonzalez was 40 years old. His children told him he was too old to go back to college. "You will look like a grandpa," they joked. "That's not true," said Mr. Gonzalez. "I will be the wisest student there." Mr. Gonzalez graduated from college 4 years later. His children were very proud of him. Jenny White loved her cats. She owned 6 of them. Jenny spent all her days with the cats. Her friends worried about her. "You should go out more," they said. "I can't stand leaving my cats alone," replied Jenny. One day, Jenny met a man at work. He was funny and handsome. Jenny started going out with him a lot. She thought he was perfect. Jenny invited him to her house. She was very excited. "He's going to love my cats," she thought. The man walked into her house. He started sneezing. He couldn't breathe. He was allergic to cats. "I hate cats," he screamed. Ms. Jackson's car broke down. She took it to the car shop. It had to stay there for 1 week. Ms. Jackson needed a car. She had to get to work somehow. "You can take the bus," said her friend. Ms. Jackson had never taken the bus. She was scared of it. She thought she would get lost. "I've even heard of people getting robbed on buses," she said. "You'll be fine," said her friend. Ms. Jackson got on the bus. It was not very scary. She was actually very relaxed. She ended up falling asleep. She missed her stop and was late for work. Daniel caught a cold. He had fever and chills. His nose was running all day. He couldn't even stop sneezing. Daniel visited the doctor. He was told to rest and relax. "Stay in bed for 3 days," said the doctor. Daniel did not listen. His friends wanted to go swimming. "Come with us," they told him. "You'll be fine." Daniel and his friends stayed in the pool until late at night. The next morning, Daniel felt terrible. His voice was completely gone. He was shaking all morning. He stayed this way for 5 days. He called his doctor for help. "You didn't listen to me, did you?" his doctor asked. Mary Green wanted a new pair of shoes. She wanted some blue heels. They cost $150. Mary asked her dad for money. "Are you crazy?" said Mr. Green. "You don't even wear heels." Mary couldn't stop thinking about the heels. She kept bothering Mr. Green about them. Mr. Green felt bad. He wished he could afford the shoes. It would make Mary happy. Mr. Green saved money for Mary's birthday. He gave her the shoes. Mary wore them all night. They left her giant blisters. Mary hated them. She never wanted to wear them again. Mary told Mr. Green that she lost them. Michael Phillips is overweight. He wants to lose a lot of weight because he is not happy with how he looks. He is also very unhealthy. His last doctor's appointment was scary. He was told he was at risk of heart disease. Mr. Phillips knows that his diet needs to improve. He eats a lot of burgers and chips. He hardly picks up any fruits or vegetables. "Eating healthy is so boring," complains Mr. Phillips. The doctor gave him more advice. "You need to try exercising more," Mr. Phillips was told. He hardly ever even walks. He bought a treadmill. Mr. Phillips was very determined to succeed. It was a big day for Ms. Wilson. She had just gotten her paycheck. She was on her way to buy her first bicycle. Ms. Wilson grew up in a poor family. They could never afford to buy her a bicycle. Ms. Wilson was now 30 years old. She had a good job and 2 children of her own. She wanted to teach them how to ride a bike, but first she had to learn herself. She chose a big blue bike from the bicycle store. Now it was time to practice. Her first day on the bike was terrible. "This is so much harder than it looks," she yelled. After many, many falls, Ms. Wilson got it down. She felt very proud. "I can't wait to teach my kids now," she said. Mark Smith needed to get a job. There was one problem. Mark was a bit lazy. He wanted to do something easy. "I know," he said. "I can be a waiter." "I don't think that's the best job for you," said his mom. "Why not?" Mark replied. He thought the job looked very simple. "All I have to do is clean tables," said Mark. "Plus, I would get big tips." Mark got hired as a waiter in a small cafe. He soon realized his mom was right. Everyone who ate left a big mess on the table. Mark hated cleaning up. He was very slow at it, too. He kept dropping plates on the floor. To top it off, he wasn't very nice to customers. They left him small tips. Mark was fired after 3 days. Sharon Carter wanted to take a pottery class. She didn't want to go alone. She invited her husband to go with her. "I don't want to do that," said Mr. Carter. "Pottery is for girls." This made Sharon very angry. She could not believe he said that. "That's a sexist thing to say," yelled Sharon. She argued with him for hours. Mr. Carter was tired of fighting. He agreed to go just to shut Sharon up. Their first class went very well. Mr. Carter was really good at making pots. The instructors loved him. "You are very talented," they all said. Mr. Carter went to pottery class every week after that. He loved it. Deborah and Paul Evans loved nature. They especially liked hiking. They hiked the mountain almost every evening. They always took their dog, Buddy. Buddy loved his owners. Hiking was one of his favorite things, too. One day, the news reported a cougar sighting. "We advise hikers to beware the mountains tonight," said the reporter. Deborah and Paul thought about staying home that evening. "I'm sure we'll be safe," said Paul. "Cougars usually hide from humans." Deborah, Paul, and Buddy made it to the top of the mountain. Suddenly, they heard a roar. The cougar jumped out. It leapt at Deborah's face. Buddy jumped to save her. He scared the cougar away. Mr. and Mrs. Evans bought him 1,000 treats and toys the next day. Kenneth Baker woke up early Sunday morning. A terrible thing had happened. His cat was missing. "He must have run away again," thought Kenneth. He went around asking his neighbors for information. "That's odd," said his neighbor Sandra. "My Chihuahua went missing last night, too." Kenneth kept walking around the neighborhood. He hoped to find the cat roaming the streets. Instead, Kenneth found something else. There were signs everywhere. They all said, "Missing cat" or "Missing dog." "I don't think these animals are running away," thought Kenneth. Then Kenneth saw something that broke his heart. There was a trail of blood on the floor. It led to the mountainside. A coyote must be taking all the small pets in the night. Lisa Adams was going out with friends. She was about to walk out of the house. Her mom stopped her. "What are you wearing?" shouted Mrs. Adams. "They're just shorts," replied Lisa. Mrs. Adams thought they looked more like underwear. "You're not going out wearing those," she said. Lisa said that wasn't fair. After half an hour of arguing, Mrs. Adams let Lisa leave. The next day, Mrs. Adams and Lisa went out to lunch. Mrs. Adams wore a tank top and very short shorts. "What are you wearing?" shouted Lisa. She was embarrassed to walk around with her mom showing her butt. "They're just shorts," replied Mrs. Adams. Kevin Turner wanted to get a tattoo. He couldn't wait to get his first one. Tattoos are expensive. Kevin couldn't afford to go to a professional. "Don't worry," said his friend. "I know a guy who will do it for free." Kevin wasn't sure that was safe. He agreed to it anyways. Kevin asked the tattooist to draw a rose on his arm. The tattoo hurt a lot. Kevin couldn't take the pain. He shut his eyes tightly. He did not open them until the tattoo was finished. "What is that?" yelled Kevin. "It's a rose," said the tattooist. It looked more like a rock to Kevin. He never got a free tattoo again. Helen Young was an unlucky woman. So many bad things happened to her. She was always getting into accidents. None of them were her fault. 1 year ago, there was a small earthquake. It caused a telephone pole to crack. The pole landed on top of Helen's car. Another time, there was a small storm. Helen loves the rain. She walked outside to enjoy it. She was struck by lightning within 1 minute. Everyone laughed at Helen's bad luck. One day, that all changed. Helen tripped on the sidewalk. She found a lottery ticket laying on the ground. It had the winning numbers. Helen was now an unlucky millionaire. George Hernandez had 2 best friends. They had been friends since elementary school. Now they were all grown up. George was moving away to a university. Stephen was starting a family in another city. Charles got a job in another state. They had to say goodbye. George didn't want them to ever forget each other. "Let's make a time capsule," he said. They all went home. They looked for things that held memories of their being together. They found old toys, pictures, and CDs. They put them in a box. Then they buried the box in a park. The boys promised to get together in 10 years. They would dig up the box and feel like children again. Betty Scott got big news. Her only son was going to have a baby. "I'm finally going to be a grandma," she thought. Betty was very excited. She couldn't wait for the baby to arrive. "I need to get the baby something special," Betty said. She decided to make a blanket. She would knit it herself. Betty was an elderly woman. Her hands weren't as strong as they used to be. They shook a lot and hurt often. Knitting was much harder than she remembered it. Still, Betty kept working on the blanket. "Anything for that baby," she thought. Betty struggled with the blanket for many months. She finished it right before the baby was born. It was the best present the baby ever got. Brian Nelson was late for work. He had been stuck in traffic for half an hour. The cars were finally starting to move. Brian had to make it to work in 10 minutes. If he was late, he would be in big trouble with his boss. "There's no way I'll make it in time," said Brian. Suddenly, a car raced past him. 3 seconds later, another car raced past him. They were going around 80 miles per hour. Brian knew that speeding was the only way he would make it to work on time. He looked around him. There were no cops in sight. He decided to push the speed up to 70. 2 seconds later, he heard sirens behind him. Linda has a younger sister. Her name is Ruth. Linda is usually annoyed by Ruth. She tries to get away from her. Ruth follows her like a lost puppy. Linda is used to that by now. Ruth always looks up to Linda. She tries to do everything that Linda does. One day, Linda was getting ready to go out with friends. Linda didn't notice that Ruth was watching her when she was putting on her makeup. When Linda got home, Ruth was waiting for her in her room. Her face was covered with permanent markers. "What did you do?" shouted Linda. "I painted my face like you," answered Ruth. Elizabeth Williams was a beautiful girl. She grew up with her dad. Her dad was overprotective. He knew a lot of guys were interested in Elizabeth. Mr. Williams did his best to scare them all away. boys would try to get Elizabeth's attention. Some would throw rocks at her window. They thought Mr. Williams wouldn't catch them. Mr. Williams bought 2 guard dogs. He trained them to attack boys who tried this. Some boys would try to walk Elizabeth home. Mr. Williams made sure this didn't happen. He parked right in front of her school every day. He brought his dogs with him each time. Elizabeth was single for a very long time. Donald Campbell needed to go to New York. He lived in Los Angeles. Driving there would take 3 days. His only other option was to take an airplane. That would take around 6 hours. Donald was afraid of airplanes. He had never been on one. "That's a dumb fear," said his friend. "Cars are more dangerous than airplanes." Donald was sure this was a lie. He didn't trust something so big in the air. Donald ignored his friend. He was going to drive for 3 days. Halfway through the trip, Donald got very sleepy. He was on the highway. He crashed into a giant trailer. Kimberly and Jason were surfing. They did this every weekend. They were far into the ocean. Suddenly, something touched Jason's foot. Jason froze. "Is something wrong?" asked Kimberly. "Don't move," Jason replied. "I think there's a shark under us." Kimberly panicked. She put goggles on. Then she looked under the water. When she came back up, she had a big smile on her face. She was laughing very loud. "This isn't funny," said Jason. Suddenly, a baby seal jumped onto Jason's surfboard. Jason screamed and jumped into the water. He hid there for almost a minute. "That's the shark," said Kimberly. Jason was very embarrassed. Mr. and Mrs. King had a teenage daughter named Michelle. They were always arguing with her. Michelle was a good daughter. However, her parents were very strict. One evening, Michelle wanted to go out. Her parents weren't letting her go. "Your room isn't clean enough," shouted Mrs. King. Michelle decided to sneak out. Her parents did not know where she was going. The next morning, Mrs. King went to Michelle's room. She wanted to apologize for being so hard on her. Michelle was nowhere to be found. Since they did not get to ask where she was going, they did not know where to look. They never saw Michelle again. The Wright family loves fishing. They head to a nearby lake every weekend. They used to catch a lot of fish. Now they are lucky to end up with 2 fish altogether. There are differences at the lake. The water used to be crystal blue. Recently, it started looking a lot greener. It even smells a bit nasty. Mr. Wright is getting worried about it. There is a factory about a mile away from the lake. Mrs. Wright suspects that they are responsible for the changes. They're probably dumping their waste in the water, she says. That's probably killing all the fish. They probably won't eat the fish they catch there anymore. Sarah's car wasn't turning on. She checked the engine. She saw the problem. One of her pipes was loose. She would have to buy a new piece to fix it. Sarah headed to the local auto shop. After she bought the pipe, An employee offered to help her put it in her car. "No, thanks," said Sarah. "I can do it myself." The employee laughed when she said this. "What's so funny?" asked Sarah. "Girls don't know how to fix cars," said the man employee. Sarah was furious. She almost smacked him with the pipe. Instead, she talked to his manager. Then, on her way out the door, she knocked a shelf over. "I hope men know how to clean," she said. David was a short man. He had always been the smallest boy in class. As an adult, he barely even passed 5 feet. His height made David's self-esteem very low. He wanted to change that. David had always liked sports. Sadly, short people have a hard time fitting in on most sport teams. "Have you thought about becoming a horse jockey?" asked a friend. David decided to give it a try. The next day, David visited the local racetrack. David didn't even get a chance to introduce himself. 3 people came up to ask if he was interested in joining their racing team. His height was finally a huge advantage. David fit right in. Thomas looked like a tough guy. "Nothing can scare me," he always said. "Not even a ghost?" asked his friend. "Of course not," said Thomas. "Ghosts aren't even real." The next day, Thomas and his friends were bored. They went to go explore the neighborhood. They ran into an old abandoned house. They dared Thomas to go inside. He had to stay there for 5 minutes. Thomas was very brave at first. He couldn't see anything in the dark. Suddenly, he started hearing things. It sounded like a woman screaming. Thomas ran out of the house, crying. Michael lived in Minnesota. He was visiting the West Coast. His friends were going to show him around. "I just want to see Las Vegas," said Michael. "Are you sure?" asked his friends. Michael insisted. He had always wanted to go to Las Vegas. Michael had seen a lot of movies about Vegas. Everything looked very bright and fancy. He couldn't wait to see it. When they arrived, Michael was confused. The streets all looked dirty and old. In the movies, everyone looked happy. In reality, half the people were drunk. The other half were angry from losing money in casinos. "This isn't what I pictured," said Michael. Nancy was 16 years old. She wanted to learn how to drive. Her parents were too busy to teach her. Nancy asked her older sister to help her. She didn't have any time either. Nancy was frustrated. "I'm sure driving isn't even that hard," thought Nancy. One night, she waited for everyone to go to bed. She sneaked downstairs. She grabbed the car keys and went outside. She was going to teach herself to drive. Nancy turned the engine on. She backed the car up slowly. Then she pressed the gas pedal. She had no idea the car was that fast. She hit a small bump and pressed the brake. When she looked back, she saw a dark shadow. She had run over her dog. Jeff was a 40-year-old man. He had no job. He never even went to school. Jeff had lived with his parents his whole life. They were starting to worry about him. All Jeff did every day was play video games. "You need to do something with your life," said his parents. Jeff ignored them. He was happy with his life. Jeff's parents came up with a plan. They started asking him for rent money. "How am I supposed to pay that?" asked Jeff. "With a job," replied his mom. When Jeff didn't give them rent, they took all his video games and sold them. Jeff was furious. He went out to look for a job. He needed to buy the video games back. Christopher bought a new car. He was going to travel the country with it. His friends helped him prepare for the trip. "You should carry a spare tire," said Brian. Christopher didn't see the point in that. "New cars don't need spare tires," he said. 1 week later, Christopher went on his trip. He couldn't wait to explore the country. Suddenly, he heard a loud pop. His car started making a strange noise. Christopher pulled over to the side of the highway. He walked around his car. A back wheel had popped. He had barely driven for 1 hour. Christopher had to call Brian for help. Brian laughed at him for hours. Thanksgiving is one of the biggest holidays in the U.S. It is followed by another major U.S. holiday. This day is known as Black Friday. On this day, stores hold big sales. Then, Americans across the country go crazy. A lot of people get violent on Black Friday. One year, Carol went shopping on the day. She wanted to buy a new coat. "I hope the mall isn't too crowded," she said. She couldn't believe her eyes. Every store was flooded with people. Carol spotted a nice blue coat in one store. It was on sale for $20. Carol was about to try it on. Suddenly, a lady jumped at her and took the coat away. "I'm going home," said Carol. Barbara invited her friends over to her house. She was excited to show them her new house. "What do you guys think?" she asked them. Her friends didn't know what to say. They looked around and tried to think of something nice to say. "It's interesting," said Betty. Barbara had a strange taste. Everything in her house was pink. This included the curtains, the sofas, and even the carpet. "What does your husband think about it?" asked Betty. "He loves it," said Barbara. Betty and the other women didn't believe her. "I swear he does," said Barbara. "He picked the color himself." Mr. Moore was retired. He used to be an actor. He was very loved and famous. Everywhere he went, women would stop him. They used to want to hug him and take pictures. He was a very handsome man. It was rare to ever see him by himself. Now, Mr. Moore was almost always alone. Many years had passed since his acting days. He had aged a lot. Sometimes he walked around Hollywood Boulevard. He hoped somebody would recognize him. No one ever did. He was no longer handsome. His good looks were now covered with wrinkles. He wished he could be young again. Richard had always been very tall. He was the biggest boy in elementary school. He used this to be a bully. He always pushed the small kids around. He did this all through high school. Many kids hated Richard. He made many people cry. As an adult, Richard was not very successful. He always thought he would be a basketball player. However, he hurt his knee and could not play anymore. Now, Richard needed a job. Richard applied to many places. He knew all the bosses of the companies. They were the men Richard used to bully his children. Richard had a very hard time finding a job. It was Mr. and Mrs. Martin's 1-year anniversary. Mr. Martin wanted to surprise his wife. He decided to cook a nice meal for her. He would make her favorite dish. After hours of cooking, Mr. Martin was finished. He set the table before she got home. He wanted to make the evening perfect. He lit a lot of candles around the house and turned off the lights. Soon the doorbell rang. Mr. Martin ran to the door. On his way there, he tripped over a candle. The flame landed on a curtain. The fire grew quickly. Soon it spread to the carpet. Mr. Martin ran out of the house. Mrs. Martin was definitely surprised. Patricia went to a private university. She couldn't afford it herself. She was lucky to receive a scholarship to pay for her. Many other people at the school were very rich. This made Patricia uncomfortable sometimes. All her classmates dressed in expensive clothing. Patricia could barely even pay for her books. The last thing she was going to do was spend money on clothing. Her classmates all drove fancy sports cars. Patricia took the bus to school. She was embarrassed for not having money. "Don't worry," said her mom. "Soon you're going to graduate. You will get a great job with your degree. One day you will be as rich as them. Maybe you will be even richer." James and Susan grew up together. They had always been best friends. Now they were going to turn 30. So much had changed. Susan was about to get married. James had introduced Susan to her fiancé. He knew they would get along great. It made James very happy to see Susan happy, too. However, James felt very strange. Susan's wedding was near. Suddenly, James started feeling very jealous. "What have I done?" he thought. After 20 years of friendship, James realized something. He was in love with Susan. It was too late to do anything about it now. Margaret was very close to her mom. They had always been best friends. Margaret was now 25 years old. It was time for her mom to let her go out on her own. "You have to be more independent," said her mom. Margaret didn't want to. "I don't want to leave you alone," said Margaret. She was scared that her mom would be too lonely. She was usually a very shy woman. She was allergic to fur, so she couldn't even have a pet. "Don't worry about me," said her mom. "Once you move out, my new boyfriend can move in with me." Joseph had a new job. He was a security guard for his favorite band. He thought it would be the best job ever. He would get to listen to the band play every night. He would even get paid for it. Joseph quit the job after the first night. He was walking the band into their tour bus. Suddenly, a mob of crazy girls started chasing them. He thought he could handle the girls. He was very wrong. They were much stronger than they looked. Joseph ended up with a black eye and a scratched-up face. "The pain isn't worth the money," said Joseph. Paul hated sports. He was very bad at them, too. Yet suddenly, he started practicing for football and basketball tryouts. "Why are you doing this?" asked Robert. "I need to be more active," replied Paul. Robert didn't believe Paul. Still, he wanted to support his friend. Robert went with Paul to the tryouts. That was when Robert figured out why Paul suddenly cared about sports. Paul kept looking over to the cheerleaders. His crush, Susan, had just joined the squad. Paul was the worst player at tryouts. He got tackled very hard in football. Then he got hit in the head by a basketball. He had no chance of making the team. Donna got an idea. "I can be a dog walker," she said. One of her friends was a dog walker. She heard that dog walkers can make a lot of money just for hanging out with puppies. "You can't do that," said her boyfriend. "Why not?" asked Donna. "You hate dogs," he answered. This was true. Donna denied it. She really wanted an easy way to make money. On her first day of dog walking, she had 5 customers. Donna had no idea dogs were so strong. They dragged her down the street running. Donna lost hold of their leashes. She lost the dogs and all her customers in one day. John was new to Los Angeles. He had never lived in a city before. He used to live on a farm. He had loved the city so far. One evening, John agreed to meet his friends in downtown LA. He was late to their dinner. He couldn't find parking anywhere. A stranger walked up to his window. "I can park your car for you," he said. John thought this man was the valet. John thanked the man and gave him his keys. After dinner, John couldn't even find the valet booth. "We don't have a valet," said the waiter. John's car had been stolen. Even though he liked the city, he did not like the people.